Friends, in this section of our course, Introduction to the Qur'an, dedicated in particular to the interpretation of the Qur'an, we've begun with 2 lectures specifically on the genre or the type of Islamic literature which is dedicated expressly to exegesis or commentaries of the Qur'an. We began by a general lecture on classical commentaries on the Qur'an, and then in our last session we had a discussion with Professor Munim Surri of the University of Notre Dame on the question of modern commentaries on the Qur'an. But it's important to point out that explanation of the Qur'an, or generally exegesis of the Qur'an, is not limited to those works strictly dedicated to commentary, but in fact, the interpretation of the Qur'an takes place in various sorts of Islamic sciences. One example of these Islamic sciences is that of jurisprudence or law. The Qur'an becomes an important source and needs to be interpreted when Muslim jurisprudence or legal scholars are developing their thought on how to apply the sources of religion in Islam, the sources of revelation, to the way that Islam should establish laws, rules, and regulations in Islamic societies. This science of law or jurisprudence is known in Arabic as fiqh. In the jurisprudence, who think about the law are known as fuqaha. Now, all fuqaha agree that the first source of law must be the Book of God, must be the Qur'an. But the question is how to use the Qur'an. And in this lecture, we will see how they did just that. We'll begin with the challenge of the way that legal scholars dealt with material in the Qur'an which seems to contradict, which seems to be in contrast. This was one of the biggest challenges because the conviction of the fuqaha or jurisprudence was that the Qur'an is a source of law and that the Qur'an is a perfect book. Therefore, any contradictions or contrasts must only be apparent. One of the methods that they used to reconcile apparent conflicts or contradictions in the text was something called abrogation or naskh in Arabic. According to this idea of abrogation, God revealed certain verses at certain points in the Prophet Muhammad's life, but anything that comes later can replace something that comes earlier. That is, God might have revealed later to the Prophet Muhammad a new ruling which could indeed abrogate or cancel out an earlier ruling. Of course, for this whole system to work, for this whole idea to work, one must read the Qur'an chronologically according to the Prophet Muhammad's life. And we've said that from an academic perspective, this is not the best way to read the Qur'an chronologically. But here our interest really is Islamic tradition, so we're going to follow the logic of how this notion of abrogation works. Let's use one example to make this point. We'll look at some others too, but begin with the example of alcohol, or more specifically, wine. Now, there are 3 different verses which speak explicitly about the possibility and the permission one might have to drink wine, or to drink alcohol generally. One of these in Qur'an chapter 2, verse 219, seems to say that there are good and bad things about drinking wine. This verse reads, "They ask you about intoxicants and gambling. Say, there is gross sin in them, and some benefits for people, but their sinfulness outweighs their benefit." So there's some that's good, some things about them that's good, and other things about them that's not good. But those which are not good outweigh those which are good. It doesn't seem to be an outright prohibition of wine. By the way, I should just make the point here. I'm going back between the words wine and alcohol. The Quranic text literally says wine. Our translation renders that as intoxicants because of the standard interpretation of this word wine to mean anything that can make you drunk. Indeed, that too is an element of interpretation. The Quranic text needs to be interpreted. Well, let's look at the 2 other verses which deal with wine or intoxicants. In Quran chapter 4, verse 43, the Quran has God declare, "O you who believe, do not approach the prayer while you are drunk, so that you know what you say." Here the problem doesn't seem to be drinking. Wine or alcohol is not prohibited. The problem is only being drunk at prayer. But then there's a 3rd verse, Quran chapter 5, verse 90, where the Quran has God declare, "O you who believe, intoxicants, gambling, idolatry, and divination are abominations of Satan's doing. Avoid them so that you may prosper." Here we seem to have something closer to a complete prohibition, although it's not explicitly so, but it's closer to a complete prohibition of drinking wine. Now, Islamic tradition says this 3rd verse, Quran chapter 5, verse 90, was revealed to Muhammad later than the first 2 verses that come from chapters 2 and 4, and therefore it abrogated or replaced or annulled or canceled out the rulings which seem to permit alcohol, even if they discourage it. And instead, it's only this verse that has legal value. Now, the two other verses are still part of the Quranic text. They're still read as God's word. They're still recited. But they don't have a legal value, according to this theory of abrogation, when it comes to the question of alcohol. Now, a similar approach is taken on other issues. One issue, a further issue we might examine, is the question of how Muslims are to behave towards non-Muslims. That is, how should one respond to those who reject the claim of Muhammad to be a prophet? We have certain verses in the Qur'an which seem to encourage Muhammad himself and the believers simply to be patient with those who refuse to believe. For example, we could look at Qur'an chapter 68, verse 44, in which God seems to declare, "It's my job to deal with unbelievers, not yours." More explicit is Qur'an chapter 73, verse 10, where the Qur'an has God say, "And endure patiently what they say, and withdraw from them politely." Here the Qur'an seems to be saying you should simply be patient in the face of unbelief. It's not your job to fight against or punish or even to oppose the unbelievers. Be patient with them. But then we have other verses, for example in chapter 9, which is generally considered one of the last surahs to be revealed, according to which the unbelievers indeed are commanded, not just encouraged, but commanded to fight the unbelievers. For example, chapter 9, verse 5 is a famous verse. It's called the sword verse, which speaks about killing the polytheists, killing the unbelievers. Chapter 9, verse 13 has God make the same point through questions. Will you not fight a people who violated their oaths and planned to exile the messenger and initiated hostilities against you? Do you fear them? It is God you should fear if you are believers. Now we can see how the method of reading the Qur'an used by some legal scholars, according to abrogation, could in fact encourage a more militant interpretation of the Quranic text. According to this method, those passages which are more irenic or more peaceful were abrogated or replaced by those later passages which are more militant. Not all Muslim scholars follow this method of reading the text, and indeed those Muslim scholars who encourage a peaceful interpretation of the text would say we need to develop other methods. Nevertheless, for jurisprudence, this notion of abrogation was influential. Let's give one final example of abrogation, which will show us some of the questions surrounding the legitimacy of this method. Quran chapter 2, verse 115 reads, "To God belong the east and the west. Whichever way you turn, there is God's presence." And then Quran chapter 2, verse 144, later in that same surah, declares, "We have seen your face turn towards the heaven, so we will turn you towards a direction that will satisfy you. So turn your face towards the sacred mosque." Now this latter verse is used as an explanation for why Muslims around the world all pray towards the city of Mecca, or more specifically to the Kaaba, the building in the center of the shrine in Mecca. And it's sometimes explained that this verse, which commands Muslims, according to this interpretation, to pray towards Mecca, the reference in the verse to sacred mosque is taken as a reference to the Kaaba, again, interpretation, that this verse replaced the legal meaning of the verse 115 in Surah Al-Baqarah in chapter 2, which seems to say you can pray in any direction. To God belong the east and the west. Whichever way you turn, there is God's presence. According to this way of reading the text, even though these two verses are in the same surah, one replaces another. But one must point out that not all Muslim scholars agree with this method of reading the Qur'an. Not all agree that Qur'an verse 144 in fact abrogates or replaces Qur'an chapter 2 verse 115. Some would make the point that verse 115 in fact is not about the direction of prayer, but is a simple pious statement about God being everywhere. Well, before we conclude this reflection on interpreting the Qur'an in the context of Islamic law, let's look a bit at the entire system of jurisprudence, because it's important to point out that the Qur'an is hardly the only source of law in Islamic tradition. Indeed, the Qur'an only occasionally discusses legal matters. The Qur'an, above all, is taken up with pious or religious exhortations, with discourses on the Day of Judgment, on heaven, on hell, on punishment stories, on the signs of God and nature, not about rules and regulations, which make up only a small part of the Quranic text. Thus, Muslims necessarily needed to look at other sources in order to establish Islamic law. Indeed, many things we associate with Islam, for example, circumcision or praying 5 times a day, or the headscarf are never explicitly mentioned in the Qur'an. How does this work? How did they all become an important part of Islamic practice? And the reason is that there's a second important source of revelation according to Islamic belief. Muslims hold that not only is the Qur'an the word of God, but the words and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad are a second source of revelation, that Muhammad himself was something like a mirror of the divine will. Everything he said, everything he did, reflected God's will for humanity. This general notion of Muhammad as exemplar is known in Arabic as Sunnah. He is the exemplary one. His Sunnah is the example, indeed, to be followed. And the reports which give, in fact, accounts of his example are known as hadith. So we have these two words, Sunnah and hadith. Together they make up the second source of law for Muslim scholars. And we'll see if we examine particular rulings about open questions for Muslim jurisprudence that they look both to the Qur'an and to the Sunnah and providing a certain decree or a certain ruling on a question. Let's look at 2 examples of this. One example is a question of music. Now, Muslim scholars actually dispute whether music is permitted or prohibited according to Islamic law. One of the Muslim scholars who argues that it's actually prohibited is a conservative Saudi mufti known as al-Munajjid. And in order to make the point or to advance the argument that music is prohibited according to Islamic law, he first quotes from the Qur'an. He quotes from 2 passages. First, Qur'an chapter 31, 6. Now, the Qur'an never explicitly says that music is prohibited, so he has to be creative. He quotes first from Qur'an chapter 31, 6, which says, "And of mankind is he who purchases idle talks," or according to our translation, distracting tales. And then Munajjid says, the proper interpretation of idle talks is music or singing. And the verse continues, to mislead men from the path of God. He also quotes chapter 53, verses 59 and 61. "Do you marvel at this discourse, and laugh and do not weep, lost in your frivolity?" This word frivolity, according to Munajjid, is an allusion to music. And then Munajjid, because there's not really enough in the Qur'an to make the point that music is prohibited, turns to a hadith, or a saying of the Prophet Muhammad. And he recites, "The Messenger of God said, among my community there will be people who will permit fornication, silk, alcohol, and musical instruments." The logic of this tradition, according to Munajjid, is that all of these things, permitted by some members of the community, in fact, were prohibited by God. Fornication, silk, wearing silk, alcohol, and musical instruments. Of course, other Muslims, it's important to point out, have very different interpretations on this point. Indeed, for example, in the mystical tradition of Islam, Sufism, music plays an important role in Sufi rituals. And of course, if you go to the Islamic world today, in the great majority of cities, you'll hear lots of music playing everywhere. Well, let's look at a second example. Here it's the case of smoking. Munajjid makes a case, again, that smoking is prohibited. Now, again, Muslim scholars don't agree on this, and that's why I'm pointing to these particular examples to show that there are different ways of interpreting the Islamic sources. Munajjid, to make his case, first makes a logical argument. He says, there is no disagreement among the physicians and sane people that smoking is harmful for health. It is one of the major causes of lung cancer and other diseases. We know about all these things. And he then says, since it is known that the Islamic law prohibits everything that is harmful for a human being, God said, and then he quotes Qur'an chapter 4, verse 29, "And do not kill yourselves, for God is merciful towards you." And we could see how he's interpreting this phrase, "do not kill yourselves." He's saying smoking is sort of a way of killing yourself. In fact, it's not really enough to make the point. The Qur'an never says, do not smoke, and cigarettes are forbidden. Something more has to be done. And so Munajjid turns to sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. He quotes two different sayings. First, he says, there is no harm or causing of harm in Islam. And another saying, according to which, a person will not be able to move on the day of judgment until he is asked about his body as to what he engaged in it, or rather what he engaged it in, what he did with his body. So Munajjid says, if we look at the evidence of the Qur'an, together with the evidence of the Sunnah and the Hadith which preserved the Sunnah, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, we have this overall principle according to which you cannot harm your body, and therefore he deduces that smoking is prohibited. Now, once again, this is one opinion, and generally a minority opinion. If you go to the Islamic world, not only will you hear lots of music, but you'll see lots of people smoking in most places in the Islamic world. But it's interesting to note that he quotes both Qur'an and Hadith. Qur'an alone is not enough to produce Islamic law. Indeed, in neither case, music and smoking, does the Qur'an have specific instructions, and so interpretation is always necessary. And that fact leads to a diversity of opinion among Muslims because there are different ways to interpret the text. Thus, we have a sense of the flexibility of Islamic law in the different ways in which the Qur'an can be interpreted.